This is her second time with OAH, and between the two OAH positions, she worked for 18 years with BIIA. She graduated magna cum laude from Seattle University in 1996. Her undergraduate degree was in music. Her instrument is the piano. I looked this up. The piano is the fourth most difficult instrument to learn, to play, and to master. I think being an ALJ is a career that is as hard to master. Meng Chi is one of my favorite people in the whole world. She's also an assistant chief industrial appeals judge at the BIIA, and she is the assistant chief sponsor for the BIIA Mediation program and the Claim Resolution Settlement Agreement program. Because of the Zen charm that I bought Meng many, many years ago and my need for new glasses, of course, she and Judge Bradley will keep you all awake with their presentation of mediation principles and online mediation.
Thank you, Helen. Well, welcome everyone to Mediation Principles and Online Mediations. Now that Helen had mentioned that, I almost mispronounced it myself. And so welcome everyone. We really appreciate you coming and joining us this afternoon. It's that heart of the afternoon where the lunch has kicked in, and hopefully we will keep you entertained. And if you all have any questions during this, please shoot them in the chat. We will kind of monitor the chat throughout the proceeding. And when Laura and I agreed to do this, we never asked for a list of the participants. And so we don't exactly know everyone who's in the room. We don't know if your agency has a mediation program, if there are limits on those mediation programs. And so we do have a quick poll that Laura is going to throw up here for you. And so it starts with, does your agency have a mediation option? Are there limits on what can be mediated? What percentage participate in mediation? What is your resolution rate if you know it? And what training do your mediators have? And so we'll just give you a moment to take that poll. And for those that are finishing early, it's always a bit of a gamble when somebody you know is introducing you, because you just never know what's going to come out. And so thank you, Helen, for keeping it nice and clean and professional. So I appreciate that. Helen and I worked together when we were in the public defender's office together many years ago. So thank you.
Somebody commented maybe we should ask for their best guess, which is, there really are no right or wrong answers here. As Meng said, we didn't know who our audience was, and we thought it would be interesting for everyone to see, what percentage of folks in the webinar are using mediation, how it's working for you, and what the resolution rates are. So I was going to mention to folks while we're waiting, I don't know if Helen got into this much detail, but as I was preparing, I realized I'd been an administrative law judge for 23 years. So, and only the gray hair shows that, I hope.
All right, so it looks like probably a quarter of the agencies have a mediation program, I'd say. And of the ones who responded, yes, of those available, it looks about a quarter. And it looks like there's some ambiguity as to whether or not there are limitations on the programs. And I'm seeing a pretty high percentage of participation and resolution and certification. So I think there might have only been one or two people who responded to those last ones. So, well, thank you so much for responding. Now we know where we can go from here and what we can focus on, give particular focus to. And so I appreciate that. And moving on to the next one, the next slide is, what is mediation? And mediation at its core is an alternative dispute process or mechanism. It's a tool basically where a mediator facilitates a mutually acceptable resolution amongst the interested parties. And seeing some other things pop up. Basically, gives the parties the opportunity to self-determine their outcome. When I'm in mediation, I oftentimes use this analogy that you're the gambler at a gambling table, and specifically, I think the game is called craps. I don't particularly gamble, so I don't know, but I think it's craps, right? When you throw the dice, and so they always say yes, that's the right one. So, I tell them, I was like, you have the dice in your hand and you can walk away with what's in front of you. Or you can, roll the dice and keep rolling until you don't advance or you lose everything. And so I let them know that is their opportunity to hold the dice, play, or, do what they'd like to do. And so when I look at mediation as this ADR tool, mediators are responsible for the process to get people to some outcome, but the parties are the ones that are responsible for the actual outcome. And so when we look at mediations, mediation is particularly useful in complex cases where both parties stand a chance of losing. And I would posit that if parties are before you, they all recognize that they have a chance to lose, because someone's going to win, someone's going to lose if they go to a trial. And they're probably both in some ways going to lose because they're probably going to invest a lot of money in getting to a decision by the judge, especially if they have to call expert witnesses. And so I would suggest that every case potentially is one that is complex. Now, we at the Board of Industrial Insurance Appeals have a lot of cases that involve workers' compensation appeals. And then I'd probably say the second most common appeal that we have at the board, my board, is alleged workplace safety violations. And so, where I might look at a case and think that it's not a very particularly complex case because it might be for a very short duration of a benefit, such as time loss compensation or something like that. I recognize that while I may not think it's a very complex case, the parties may disagree, and they may view it not necessarily as complex, but they may have other interests that are overriding, such as most of the claimants' attorneys, and there are mostly appeals that come to the board, and most of them are by claimants. And so when we look at that, and we look at the fact that claimants' attorneys are contingent fee attorneys, their time is worth a lot. And so when I look at it from that lens, there is a lot to lose. And there's, for any party that's coming before the board, especially those claimant, parties. And so they all stand a chance of losing, and the stakes are high for them. Even if the dollar amount may seem small, there may be those other interests that make it more complex for them. Where there is new information. So we oftentimes will use mediation as an opportunity to develop the record. So parties may have, let's say, gone to see a doctor and they got one opinion, and then the Department of Labor and Industries may have got an IME that says a conflicting opinion, and the conflicting opinion has taken into consideration the attending physician, the claimant's doctor's opinion, but it didn't, the claimant's doctor did not consider the IME's doctor in rendering any further opinions. And so mediation is a great time for parties to develop that record by seeking out additional information. And the next one, which is that meaning of information is debatable. Oftentimes, especially in like the situation where we have like competing medical reports that don't necessarily cover everything, or where we have these alleged workplace violations where there are like citations written, and citations are similar to what I would consider like prosecutions when it comes under the WSBA Act. And so, you have an inspector who's done an inspection and written up a report. They may or may not have gone through a reassumption process at the department or not, and it may have come directly to the board. And so there may be, information that's debatable because, the inspector may have seen something, but may not know what all of that meant, particularly because they have to make some they have to make some decisions about what they're seeing and what that means. And so there might be some defenses that are not fully developed. And so the meaning of information is debatable because there might be different viewpoints on that information. Situation is not clear, or the law is not clear. So the mediation is particularly valuable in this too, because, for example, we had a couple years ago a change in the law that allowed claims for Hanford workers. And that's the nuclear facility plant in central Washington. And so basically, if you worked one full 8-hour shift, basically one day, minimally one day, 8-hour shift during a certain period of time in certain buildings on the Hanford facility, you could be, part of a compensable claim, even if it had previously been denied. And so it allowed people to come back and reopen claims. And so mediation was helpful in this one because parties didn't necessarily want to stick around sometimes for a claim to go through a process that's going to take years and years and years. There was a decision, on an appellate level that basically found that the law was unconstitutional, and now they're back for retrial on several of these cases. And so, that's been several years now, and there are some people who just don't want to be in the system for that long, and they don't want to wait for that, that finality. And some of them just want out now. And so mediation is a great option for them too. Now, they're going to have also cases where parties think the law is unclear, and that is the reason why mediation is not going to be a good option for them. And they may believe they have wonderful facts, strong facts, good facts, make good law, right? And so mediation may not be so helpful in those particular circumstances, but it may be also equally helpful if the law is unclear, where there is room for compromise. And when I look at compromise, compromise is a reciprocal modification of demands or needs. And so it's where both parties are going to be giving something up, and they're going to be walking away with something, and they're going to walk away with something a little bit less on some other things that they may have wanted. So I kind of think about it, it's really kind of a weird, it's like a fruit salad analogy where I'm like, somebody walks in with 4 apples, somebody walks in with 4 oranges, and by the end they're walking out with 2 of each, right? So it's different. I'm going to give you the strengths on this one and the weaknesses on that one, and we're just going to switch around, and we're going to walk out with something completely different. So giving up some of what I have, and I'm going to take some of what you have, and the other side is going to be doing exactly the same thing. But again, those also are going to require where people are willing to participate and negotiate, and where they have enough things on the table that they can compromise on. So those single issue cases, it might be a little more challenging, but they also might have different interests that you don't know about to resolve that case in mediation. And on this slide, we talk about 2 different kinds of mediation that we're going to focus on here. There are actually more types of mediation out there, but for our purposes, we're going to mainly focus on full facilitative model, which is the process you will see a portion of later in this presentation. And we also will discuss the abbreviated facilitative model. The abbreviated facilitative model is probably more consistent with what you would expect in a settlement conference. And at the board, we offer both of these models. We auto for most of our mediations, and we send almost all of our cases through mediation up front. And then we do this abbreviated facilitative model in that, and we give our mediators approximately 100 days, usually 100, sometimes up to 120. And mediators have the discretion to keep it up to 6 months or even longer than 6 months if necessary, depending on what's going on in a particular case. Mediators also can ask that a case be sent back to mediation after it's left mediation and moved on to different stages of the hearings process, and parties can ask for it to come back to mediation at any time. Sometimes parties need to do some discovery up front, and then they decide that mediation is a tool that they can use now that they have developed the record, where they've gotten additional information where they were not able to do it in the time frame that the mediator had up front, or they knew that they would be wasting people's time if they just went the route of mediation up front, and they now ask for it toward the middle or toward the end of the process. So it's much more helpful to all the parties. And so full facilitative model or the abbreviated facilitative model, we will send our judges to training for both of them. And so
model that you may have encountered, it shows up a lot in the movies. It's the evaluative model,
yeah.
Which when I was at the board, some folks would use that. Can you hear me, Ming?
Yes.
Okay.
A little soft, but I'll turn up my volume.
And so the evaluative model is useful for some parties when, say, an attorney has a client who isn't really listening to their attorney, or doesn't agree with their attorney. I remember doing settlement conferences in district court over like small claims kinds of things. And sometimes the parties did want you to say, you know, who do you think is going to win? So that's not the model that we advocate, but it is sometimes what parties are looking for, especially if they're not fully familiar with mediation.
Thank you. And Laura, as you're flipping that, I saw that there was a question in the chat. Are there WACs and RCWs? And I put the WAC the RCW 5152095 and the WAC 26312.092 into the chat, which talks about mediation at the board. So thank you for the question. I have to remember we're also doing the chat too. And Laura, thank you for adding that, the notation on the evaluative.
My pleasure. So Meg and I knew that we were going to be after Judge Galvan, and we knew that we were going to be in the mid-afternoon slump. So we thought we'd mix things up a little bit and start kind of in the middle of our presentation, avoiding the primacy or recency effects, and give you a little idea about what mediation is not.
Okay, Rachel, why don't you start talking first?
All right. I feel that this is totally unjustified. She gave me the green light. I did nothing. Do you think I can't see you in the TV set?
All right, Monica, if there is something that you would like to share.
You know, you had no right to go out with him. That is the most ridiculous.
You sold me out.
I did not say you did. You absolutely sold me. Talk. Did you just flick me? Okay, well, you wouldn't let me finish, and I was just... Ow, that hurt. Quit flicking. Ow, you stop flicking. You flicked me first. Ow, get it. Ow. Oh, all right, okay.
No, let's not do this. Let's...
Ow, come on.
Happy thoughts. Happy thoughts. Come on.
Okay, now I'm gonna kick some. Ow! 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 Ow!
Ow. All right. Now I will let go if you both stop.
Oh, what do you want me to stop seeing him? Is that what you want? Uh-huh. You want me to just call him up and tell him that you're seeing him instead? Is that what you want?
Okay.
Oh, that's what you want?
Yes.
Fine.
Fine. There we go.
That is an example of what not to do in a mediation. And unfortunately, fortunately, I have not heard of one of our mediations that look like that. And so I'm thankful for that every single day. But I do recognize that sometimes as mediations are developing, you know, the emotions run so high that you kind of sometimes can get sucked in as a mediator. You're just watching it, you know, unfold before you. And like Phoebe, you're like, oh, I'm supposed to do something. I need to do something right away. So, so we were using Phoebe, unfortunately, as an example of what not to do. Although she was effective, I will say. She was effective in some ways. And so, Laura, anything you wanted to add on that one?
No, just that I don't recommend the ear pulling to get parties to comply. And I'm sure you all have better training than Phoebe did in her mediation.
Well, that's the stick method versus the carrot method. And so, so the next slide, please, is mediation principles. And so the cornerstone of mediation is confidentiality, or one of the cornerstones is confidentiality. Basically, you know, that old saying about what happens in Vegas, right? It applies in mediation unless the parties give you a waiver to, you know, discuss something that did happen in mediation. So like at the board, one of the preliminary things that we ask the parties to do and every mediator to do before they pass a case out of mediation is that they get the parties to agree or stipulate to jurisdiction. And so there's a document that's created for that to occur. And so we ask the parties, will you stipulate and will it become, will you allow that to become part of the record? And the judge then enters that, signs that stipulation under penalty of perjury, and then enters it into the record. And so we do let the hearings judge know if for whatever reason it has to go to hearings. We do let the judge know that, that stipulation occurred, but all the conversations and the settlement discussions, consistent with the evidence rules. And we also have rules on that within the RCW and our WAC that talk about, confidentiality, and, we won't be using the statements, and there's no recording of these conferences, things like that. And that's really designed to allow people the safety, frankly, of trying to negotiate this and not have it held against them later, right? And so, occasionally when I was a hearings judge, I would get, oftentimes as a pro se party, a self-represented party who would say, but in mediation, you said you agreed, you violated this standard, or I'm, entitled to this or what. So, in those kinds of situations, I have to kind of shut that down. I'm like, those were settlement discussions. They're not part of, what's going to happen at this hearing. All those statements are, private. And, and that is for your settlement negotiations only. And so sometimes there's a reminder process that has to occur when, if parties don't complete mediation successfully and have to go to a hearings process. And so mediation is also a voluntary process. As I mentioned earlier, that example that I use about gambling, I really should come up with a new one because I don't gamble, so I really can't use all the jargon associated with it, but it's a voluntary process. And so any party, can basically walk away from the process and decide that they don't want to mediate, and that's okay. We still try to get them to at least stipulate to jurisdiction, if not possible, and then it has to go to the hearings process. We try other things, but, at the end of the day, we recognize it is a voluntary process. And so parties can at any time decide that they want to terminate the process. The mediator is a neutral. And so the mediator cannot take sides. The information that's, provided in this will in many ways, taint that neutrality of a decision maker of a mediator if they have to become a decision maker. And that's that last one down below, where mediators are not, the mediator who mediated the case is not the one who's going to ultimately make a decision or hear the case. And that's because of that appearance of neutrality, appearance of fairness. And, we're all professionals, and I'm sure we can all unring the bell, so to speak, right? We can say, okay, this is what I heard in mediation. This is what I'm hearing on the record for me to actually determine the case. But there's always going to be that specter of you have too much information, and that's going to taint your ability to, be viewed as a neutral decision maker. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the parties are going to determine this. And even in mediation, we have oftentimes, even though our mediator is not making a decision, so to speak, a discretionary ruling on, the outcome of the case, we still have parties and judges who will disclose potential conflicts. And, back in the day when I was mediating cases more regularly, there's a large retailer and employer. And whenever they would come before me, I would just let the parties know that I had family members that worked for this large retailer and that were in the management structure and things like that. And so I would still disclose that and then let them decide whether or not they wanted me to remain on the case as a mediator, even though I was not going to make a discretionary ruling about if they were going to win or lose on their appeal. I still gave them that opportunity to decide if they wanted a different mediator just because of that appearance. Another mediation principle is that, as I mentioned earlier, the resolution is determined by the parties in the appeal, right? As I mentioned, the mediator is responsible for the process in which you get to a resolution or not, and the parties are responsible for that actual resolution. The mediator is a skilled facilitator who's going to help them navigate, the bumps in the road, so to speak, but the parties are the ones that are going to build that road and, build whatever comes at the end of that road, or if they're just going to exit, whatever road they're building. And so that is also a major part of what we do. We maintain that there is integrity in this process through the entirety of the process so that people will continue to participate in this process. When I look at the resolution rates at the board and over many, many years, we keep statistics, as you can imagine. And so, traditionally resolution rates in mediation, and as I said, we probably funnel maybe upwards, over 90% of the cases probably come through mediation up front. And the mediator has a case approximately up to 100, 120 days. And traditionally 39 to 41%, so basically 40% of the appeals that were granted and were sent to mediation would resolve in mediation. And, since the pandemic has occurred, we have seen resolution rates actually jump to 47% right now. And so, we're looking at, what are the causes? Is it, reduced workload because we're having fewer appeals? Is it people are more relaxed in their homes and they're not having to fight the traffic and coming into an office to do their work? Are they just more relaxed in general because they don't have all these additional stresses? And I see that, there's a comment in here from Judge Swan about starting from a proposition, mediation has the goal of helping people move forward with their lives. And oftentimes, and it goes on, and that is absolutely correct too. Oftentimes parties are going to come to you and they are stuck, frankly. And that's why they're asking for intervention by a court. That's you, right? And so they're asking for help from the mediator to help move them out of their rut or whatever they're stuck on to get to the next phase of wherever they got to go. And so as I'm trying to read, there's a long comment by Judge Swan about the compromise. Besides compromising, sometimes the best immediate outcome is a total win for one of the parties in the action at hand, be a dismissal of the action, or the defendant granting the request of the person filing the litigation. And so, if you take a moment and read Judge Swan's comment, Judge Swan has been a mediator for many, many, can I say decades, Judge Swan? Would that make you too upset? We all have a little bit of gray hair. And so Judge Swan is a very effective mediator in our program. And so he does fantastic work. And so Judge Bradley, any additional comments on this one?
So what are the general elements or steps of mediation? We've laid them out for you. The first, of course, is the pre-mediation. Here at OAH, a lot of the longer mediations start with a pre-mediation conference where parties agree to what days the mediation is going to occur, how much time is going to be scheduled, what format do the parties want to use? Do they want to do it through video online? Do they want to do it in person? Those kinds of things. And then it's also a time to, as a mediator, I usually invite written statements before the mediation starts. And I do that because it can be really useful to me to get some background on what the dispute's about. It can also save time in the mediation because then folks can focus on the key salient points during their opening statements. That conference also helps to clarify what the parties' expectations are and what yours are. For example, I prefer that folks don't caucus unless it's absolutely necessary. I like to keep them in the room together as much as possible. So that's something I can lay out for folks so that when we get to the mediation, they're not surprised by that. We might talk about, again, how long will the mediation last? Will there be breaks? How long will the breaks be? If we're in person, what amenities will be available? Who's going to attend? You want to make sure that someone with decision-making authority is at the mediation, if at all possible. Want to explore whether there are external deadlines to be aware of, like is there a trial date coming up or a discovery deadline that has passed or is coming up, all those kinds of things. So it's really great to engage in those pre-mediation activities, and they can really help your mediation be successful. when folks do get together, then we start with the mediator opening statement. And for those of you who have attended mediation training, you know that quite a bit of time is spent developing this opening statement script. The first time I did it, I think it was homework the first night. And then we did some role playing, presenting it, and then we refined it. And the reason we do that is because there's so many key elements to hit on while you're making that opening statement. You want to remind folks that it's confidential and what that means. You want to remind them that it's voluntary. You want to talk to them about negotiating in good faith. Make the point that you're neutral. Set ground rules about how folks are going to engage with each other. Always good to have a no name calling rule, so to speak. All of those, again, are critical for setting up the trust that the parties need to engage in the mediation and trust in you as someone who's going to facilitate that. And with ground rules, when folks do get out of line, if the ground rules have been agreed upon in the beginning, then it's a useful thing because you can say, remember, at the beginning we agreed that we weren't going to call each other names, so I'd like you to honor that. It's a good way to rein people in without being super heavy-handed. And then we get to the parties' opening statements, which are critical for the parties. As I was talking to folks in my agency about the benefits of mediation, the theme that came up most often was people just really want to be heard. And so these opening statements are their chance to speak with the mediator and the other party uninterrupted. You want to make sure they have uninterrupted time to tell you what they want to tell you. And for some folks, that's really all they're wanting. We know that trust in government is at one of its all-time lows. And so sometimes folks, and I was talking to someone earlier today, with so many things being done online now, people aren't necessarily talking to employees in the agencies on a regular basis. And so they may more and more feel like they're just a number in a machine without any real perspective about what they're experiencing. So that opening statement with the uninterrupted flow can be really key for them feeling heard and can make the mediation go more smoothly. And if it's cut short in any way, it's going to make that mediation a lot harder. Let's see. And again, with those opening statements, you want to try to keep the table balanced, giving each person approximately the same amount of time. You might even set that up in the beginning. You know, we'll each start with 5 minutes, and then if there's more to say, I'll come back to you and give you another 3 minutes. Something like that might help. Or if you feel like you can manage it adequately without setting time limits, you can do that as well. During opening statements, don't forget to reflect back to the party what you heard. Again, that's a key part of feeling heard, is that someone who is listening restates it to you, and you can say to yourself, oh, okay, that person was really listening. They weren't thinking about what's for dinner tonight or what movie they want to see on the weekend. And then it's always good to get to the point where you identify some key issues. And when you're doing that, it's best to focus on the parties' interests rather than their positions. So a position might be, this is unfair and the department just needs to cancel their action. That's a position. Whereas an interest might be, I can pay them back, but I need more time. Or I want to understand where I went wrong, so I won't be in this position again. Or, many variations of that. But we want to focus on the interest. For the agency, the interest might be, we want to make sure this appellant is going to follow the law in the future because it's our job to safeguard citizens of the state. Or an agency's interest might be crafting something that doesn't necessarily set a precedent for the future, because the folks want to resolve this issue, but they don't want, the cascade of terribles, the avalanche of people seeking the same remedy when the same remedy might not be appropriate. You want to continue with building the agenda, Ming?
Before we get to that, though, Laura, there's a question in the chat about is it the preferred practice for pre-mediation written statements to be a single brief, which all parties have, or two separate briefs, one for each party and one for the mediator? Any thoughts on that? Oh, and then there's the last thing. Often there's information the party wants the mediator to know up front, but not the other party. So
yeah, so I don't think there's a preferred, as far as a global preferred. I think all of them are options, and it may depend on what type of case it is. What I typically do is folks send their briefs or their written statements to me. They're not required to share them with each other. They certainly can if they want. And I'm really looking for all of that background, kind of those unsaid feelings, ideas that might not come up in mediation, but may not come up, I should say, overtly in mediation, but might give me a perspective so that I can catch some clues and help move things along if we're getting stuck. What do you think, Ming?
I oftentimes, if I'm asking for the pre-mediation, if I'm going to do a full facilitative model, I am going to be often asking for that pre-mediation statement, and I'm going to be asking them independently from each other. I don't necessarily require them to, put one for the other party unless they so choose to. What I have found, at least in some of the ones that I've done, is that sometimes even the party that requested this full extended mediation, and we call them extended mediations at the board, and so where we're doing the full facilitative model. And if you keep seeing me touch my face or my nose, I apologize. I decided I was going to be a good employee and come to the board's office. And it's like 60 degrees in my office with like windows all over the place. And so it's a bit chilly in here today. So I apologize. You might see me wiping my nose every once in a while. But I do, ask the parties to file a pre-mediation statement. And that shows me that they have met with their client, that they kind of know the issues and what they're looking for. They've considered, because in my pre-mediation statement, I may ask them to talk about, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, what are their, best alternatives to a negotiated, an outcome. And so I'm going to be asking them those kinds of questions because I don't want them to be caught off guard for the first time at the mediation, because those are going to potentially come up in these full facilitated model mediations. And I've had, like I said, parties where they were the ones that requested it, and then they didn't actually file any mediation briefing, pre-mediation briefing. And to be honest, it really, I realized as we were actually in the mediation, because I didn't choose at that point to delay the mediation, because the parties were telling me, we need to move forward. Well, I realized at that point that one party had a very challenging client and a client relationship issue going on that made it difficult for them to really fully participate in the mediation. And so there's some, I realized in that particular instance, there were some bad faith feelings that, not everyone was participating equally. And so I do ask for that. And if the parties want to do one, I will ask them to do it together so that there's no perceived, one side's being more participatory than the other, and that there's a ground for any kind of, bad faith. And so I see that there's another question. Would having a separate brief for the mediator make it difficult for the mediator to remain neutral? And so I see that Judge Bradley responded, mediators should get briefs from both sides, not just one. And that's what I was trying to get to, is that both sides should be submitting their pre-mediation briefing. And when in the example I gave where only one side presented one and the other side did not, this was what I learned, I should have continued the mediation and asked when can that get submitted so that we can go, from an equal footing on the mediator side. And then I know also that the parties and their representatives are on board with the process. And so, okay. Oh, lots of comments are coming in. Now, Judge Swan is making a good point about balancing those pre-mediation briefs against the size of the matter at hand. Investment in those briefs take a lot of time and investment. And so, I don't require them or request them in the typical abbreviated, mediation facilitative model. I only reserve those for the full-fledged, full facilitative model mediations because, at the board, on average, our mediators are getting approximately 10 to 12 new cases per week. And so, and like I said, they have a relatively short time frame, 3 to 4 months, to try to get that case resolved and out of the system. And so I do reserve that specifically for the more facilitative models. Thank you. The building the agenda. So once the parties have identified the issues, the mediator's role is to determine what the agenda is going to be. And that's a discussion with the parties to say, these are the issues you've talked about. And basically, back in the day, we would whiteboard these, right? We would have the flip chart or, something that everybody could see. I guess if we were moving into this century, we would have, some kind of projection thing that where you could type something on a computer and you could project it onto the wall so that, no one had to look at someone's really bad handwriting, unless that you wanted to do that, right? And you, that kind of built some of that trust and relationship by having other people, different people get up and down and write things. Oftentimes this falls to the mediator to build the agenda with the parties, to have them start agreeing on what are the issues that they're going to tackle today or another mediation down the road. And so that process is actually integral because you're starting to get people to agree with each other when they have come in with, we're not agreeing on anything, to the small thing of getting them just to agree on, do you agree that the issue is this, that we can discuss this in good faith, and what the ground rules are going to be for those discussions. Like Judge Bradley said, I think she said something like, well, somebody said like no punching or using boxing gloves, things like that. One of the rules I kind of throw out there kind of in jest, but it's kind of important too, which is no talking, not no talk to each other, but keeping your hands to yourself, right? And in the video, you saw that they failed miserably at keeping their hands to themselves, all of them. But the reality is, every time you have an opportunity to get people to laugh and agree together, or just agree together, you're setting the stage for them to come to additional agreements down the road. And so that is why agenda building is so important. And it's also important because you need to set the scope. And if you don't set the scope, you can leave ground for bad faith to arise. And so sometimes, you'll have some negotiated agreement down the road, and then somebody will say, oh, by the way, we also want this. So after you've come to some kind of an agreement, someone else all of a sudden says, oh, I have to have this too. And then it kind of throws everything into the gray area. And there's, bad feelings because you're like, no, we had an agreement and now you want something more that wasn't part of the agreement. And so it's really important to get the scope of the agenda done up front. And I'm just trying to look at the chat too. And so clarify goals, going to mediation blind is not a good plan. Yeah, absolutely. Corey, it is good to have those parties come up with those statements beforehand so that they know what the issues are for them and what they want to accomplish in the mediation, which will also help with building that agenda. And, when it comes to the negotiation side, I say that the mediator is really responsible, to be the container, to contain the parties and to give them something to, a process in which to navigate. The negotiation oftentimes is literally, the mediator kind of getting out of the way and allowing the parties to talk to each other in a respectful and professional manner, because you're going to be meeting people who are going through all kinds of things in their personal lives, in their professional lives. You're just meeting people right where they're at. And And they have oftentimes a relationship with each other, especially in these extended or these full facilitative model. There's usually, because there's a relationship there, that they might want to foster, or they might want to terminate, or they might want to, in some way manipulate, or they want to modify, sorry, not manipulate, modify. And so just know that, in the negotiation process, it really is, where would you like to start? And, going from there, and then, reflecting back what things are being said and how things are being heard. And, and sometimes pulling in the other party saying, well, what did you hear? Can you summarize? Because that, number one, it tells them that you expect them to be listening. And so, but it also helps you as the mediator understand where people are coming from and how they're able to hear, or what they're able to hear. And if they're not able to hear, then you have some work to do as the mediator to help foster that negotiation going forward. And Judge Bradley had mentioned caucuses earlier, and caucuses are basically where there might be a standstill, or, kind of we don't know what to do here. It might be just a good time to take a break and go into caucus, which is where you go and meet with one side, and then, you let the other side sit, and then you flip-flop and you go meet with the other side, and you let the other side sit. But you want to make sure that you are allocating equivalent amounts of time. So you're not going to meet 30 minutes with one side and leave the other side hanging for 30 minutes and then flip-flop, and only give the other side 5 minutes of your time, right? So there's an appearance that the table is very unlevel at that point, and that you're not necessarily being, neutral to both sides and giving them equal time and opportunity. And so you want to make sure that you are definitely being mindful of timing and the types of conversations that you're having in those caucuses. And also, one of the things that we recommend highly in those caucuses, because there is that dead time where you're meeting with another party, is to always make sure that you have given them some kind of homework, right, so to speak, while they're going into caucus work, where you give them questions that you want them to think about and be able to answer. And, that might even be from, some of the discussions that were raised. And so caucus is a very useful tool if the emotions are high or there's just a standstill, in the negotiation. Caucus is a wonderful time and a wonderful method. And then bringing everyone back. And then, caucus is also confidential. So you are confidentially discussing what's going on, individual sides. And so, if you want to share something that happened in caucus with party A, you need to get party A's permission to share it with party B. So you better have practiced your poker face, where, people are looking at you and they're reading your signs and symbols. So, if they're throwing out, figures at you and they're trying to determine, are you giving any tells, you have to be monitoring your own, expressions throughout the caucus, especially when you're meeting with another side. Sometimes caucuses, and mediators have different stances on this as to whether or not they will do what they call shuttle diplomacy, where, party A will give an offer and they want the mediator to communicate it to party B, and they want party B to communicate it to party A. They have a counter offer. And so there's this shuttling back and forth of offers. And you as the mediator has to decide, is that something you want to engage in, or is that something you want them to do together? Right? So are you going to pull them out of caucus once you've given both equal time, pull them back into plenary session, into the mediation, and say, I understand that there's, parties would like to talk about some offers at this point, and then, who'd like to start, and let them go from there. Oftentimes it is, like I said earlier, the mediator just getting out of the way. Once people have figured out where the other party is, where they stand on things and what is really important to them and what those interests really are, they actually can, they actually want to start solving the problems, because number one, it means that they get themselves out of that room pretty quickly. But at the core, a lot of times people are problem solvers, and if they understand the other side, they're more willing to help develop that outcome. Agreements or litigation, there's going to come a point where the parties are going to have to decide whether or not they are going to, reach a resolution, and are they, a couple $1,000s apart, or are they ballparks apart? And if they're ballparks apart, that's probably a case that's going to go to hearings or litigation at that phase. And like I said earlier, at the board, parties can come back to mediation at any stage of the proceeding, even after the judge has issued a decision and the parties have appealed that. We call that a filing a petition for review, where the board members have 6 months to make a determination as to whether or not the judge made the right decision. Even at that phase, parties have asked for mediation, and it has come back down to mediation in those particular instances. Rare, but it is an option. So, Judge Bradley, anything you want to add on this before we move to the next one?
So the common techniques in mediation, and I'm sure there are more, but these were the ones that came to mind for us. The first is active listening, and active listening is really a key to being an effective mediator. It helps you understand the parties' perspectives. It helps you reflect statements back accurately. It helps you reframe statements successfully. And to give an example of active listening, have you ever found yourself listening to someone and in the back of your mind, you're kind of preparing your response, but then as they continue to talk, like the last 3 words they say, put a whole different light on everything they said. So you have to throw your response out the window because what you thought they were saying is not what they were actually saying. So with active listening, you let them get all the way through before you start preparing responses so that you can be sure that you're giving a fair and meaningful response. So clarifying questions can be a good way to just reality check for everyone what's being said. And as judges, you probably ask clarifying questions many times a day. So I don't think I need to go into a lot of detail, but it can be helpful to the parties so that you're just making sure that everyone understands what the situation is. You want to take reframing?
Yeah, thank you. So, I forgot to mention earlier, we have an iceberg, and that's oftentimes you'll see an iceberg when people are talking about mediations because, we see the very top of the iceberg only. And while it's glorious and beautiful, it is usually just the tip. And there's so much more below the surface. And you as the mediator are responsible for sometimes excavating, and finding out what is below the surface. What are those underlying interests? And oftentimes when you have a mediation going, you're going to have people who are charged, emotionally from whatever incident occurred or how they feel wronged about a decision or something. And it's your responsibility to take what you're hearing and without losing its context or its meaning, reframe it in such a way that it's going to remove any negative perception or views, allow it to remove, or you're going to remove any bias that may come through, and help focus some of the comments that are coming through. And so you are, always going to need to ask them when you reframe, did you reframe it correctly? Did it capture what they were saying and what were they meaning specifically? When I think about what's going on and people are talking about, why they are here, basically, they may have some very strong emotions, and it sometimes causes people to relive what they were going through. And that means that sometimes they are, going into that reptilian brain where they're in that fight, flight, freeze, where they have that anxiety and upset and they feel a threat or fear. And what, I have to remember when I'm reframing and when I'm in the mediation process is that it takes a person approximately 20 to 30 minutes from the end of the threat or fear to actually work through the emotional, psychological process of that calming down. And so part of that process is you reframing what is being said and how it's being said to help tone down any critical statements and move them through the process of that fight or flight, freeze, fawn response. And so another one of the things that you're doing in reframing is you are taking what they're saying and trying to identify if there's any common ground for that particular party or the other party, where parties are actually agreeing it's actually the same thing, they just have a different view of how it happened. And so you can help people realize or recognize that they really are on common ground. And so oftentimes reframing might start out with, I heard you say this, that you are concerned with this. Did I understand you correctly? Things like that, that, did I understand you correctly? Can you help me understand, those kinds of questions and statements, asking for that feedback. Shoe switching is another one where you're putting yourself in the other person's position. And it is that old walking in someone else's shoes exercise, right? At its core, it's asking someone, if this happened to you, how would you feel? And it's a validation almost, or asking people to work through that same process that someone else has already gone through. And that building those experiences allows people to relate better to other people in the room, which allows them to empathize and move on from what's going on. Sometimes when I'm in this reframing and shoe switching situation, I'm telling people, because they can be emotionally charged, you're kicking sand on someone, kicking dirt on someone's feet, or stepping on their feet, and, is this really going to help us move forward? And so sometimes you have to call out some of that behavior too, depending on what the situation is. But I did want to go ahead and send it back to you, Laura, Judge Bradley.
So the next on the list is summarizing, which is a little bit different than reframing. So when you're summarizing, you often may use the party's own words, and sometimes that's helpful, to hear your words coming out of someone else's mouth. It can make change your perspective a little bit. It can also be useful when there's a lull and you want to remind folks of the good work they've done. You can say things like, so this morning we addressed these two issues and we have a tentative agreement on one of them, just reminding them where they are in the process and that they're moving forward. The next is the devil's advocate, which is one that I use very sparingly and only when things are really recalcitrant. And it's tricky because it requires kind of taking a side to make a point. And I would need to think carefully if I was going to use it about whether I would do it in open session or in caucus. It might depend on the situation. It might be something like, when you say, just for the sake of argument, you think that the judge will see the law this way, but what if the judge thinks the law means this? So again, it's something to use sparingly. I maybe can only think of one occasion when I've actually used it. Back to you, Ming.
So giving constructive feedback. So this one is going to require some honesty and yet some some sensitivity when you are going to be using this particular technique, because you may need to softball this, because that constructive feedback, we throw the word constructive in there to softball it for people, but the reality is you're giving feedback to people sometimes, and it might be, hey, I noticed something, and I would probably do this in a caucus as opposed to a plenary session, because you don't want to undercut someone in a mediation in front of everyone, even if you're trying to level the table to create that equality, right? But I probably use this in a caucus where I would say, hey, I noticed something. Would you mind if I shared this insight with you? And that might be how I would introduce this constructive feedback comment. Like a simple example might be, I noticed that whenever Monica is talking, whenever Rachel is talking, I noticed that you roll your eyes. Can you tell me a little bit about why that is? Or, did you notice that, do you realize that, in that particular video with the Friends clip? And so she was doing more than just rolling her eyes, but giving that constructive feedback sometimes will bring to the surface, a lot of emotions and things that people oftentimes don't want to talk about, or don't realize, or don't ever want to be called out on. And I would recommend to you that we consider changing the verbiage of calling people out to calling people in, because it is going to stand in your way of reaching some resolution if this behavior continued. So Giving constructive feedback is one that we use also sparingly, but we would probably use it mostly in a caucus situation. Next is nailing down the details. And so putting it in writing, the scope of the dispute, the scope of the resolution. You don't want to be in that situation where you don't take the extra 5 or 10 minutes at the end of your mediation to actually write down, the bones or even, finer details of that outcome, because ironically, people either forget. You wouldn't think they would after they spent, 6-8 hours with you, but they do sometimes forget, or their client doesn't remember, and so it can blow up your mediated agreement. And so just be aware of that in these really complex, fully mediated ones. And it has happened before multiple times. And so that's why it's on the common technique bill, and you want that in writing. Okay, back to you, Laura.
Yeah, so when you're nailing down the details, really think about the nitty gritty, like if a payment is going to be made, who is it going to be made to? Is it going to be by check or by wire? When is it going to be made? If it's not made on time, what's going to happen? All those things that folks want to be clear on so that they know what their agreement is and they know what consequences might occur if they aren't able to meet their agreement. Moving on to emotional intelligence, this is really the ability to manage your own emotions. So for example, if you know certain words trigger a reaction in you, gaining awareness of that and developing techniques so that you can remain neutral and focused on the parties and not bound up in your own emotional reaction. This takes practice, and I did parenting plan modification mediations for a while, and I found a lot of times I got triggered during those mediations, and so ultimately I decided it was best for everybody if I didn't do that anymore. So that's one part of emotional intelligence, is knowing when it's not the right thing for you. And then empathy is that ability to see matters from another's perspective without imposing judgment on whether it's good, bad, fair, or not fair. So again, in those parenting plan cases, the empathy would be seeing that both parties had been hurt by each other. They were concerned about their children. They probably had different ideas about what was best for their children. So just acknowledging the pain that each of them feels and understanding that while you might handle that situation differently, being caring and understanding of where they are at that particular time. And then, Meng, do you want to talk about the environment?
Sure. So environmental setup. I commented earlier about, the temperature in my office. And, one of the things that, mediators are responsible for is making sure that the environment in which you hold your mediation is appropriate. So pay attention to temperature. If it's really, really hot in your location, I know that sounds kind of hokey, but it really is not. And it's really important. I've had, not in a particular litigation, not in a mediation, but in a litigation, parties were just like sweating bullets, in the hearing room, not because it was, a contentious case. It was just 80 degrees in the room. And so they couldn't focus. And in a mediation, you need people to focus just like they're doing in a hearing or in litigation. So be mindful of, temperature, location, size of your room. If you have a very tiny room and a lot of people, it's going to get very uncomfortable. People have like social distancing, social space that they like to maintain. So you need to make sure that the environment in which your stuff is appropriately sized for the number of people that you're going to be having in your mediation. We also recognize that, in the setup, when the mediator is often, at a table, you oftentimes will seat the representative on each side of, the mediator. But we are mindful that we try not to necessarily set the attorney between the party and yourself as the mediator. If they have a decision maker, you try to set the decision maker next to you, and then the attorney's on the outside of them, if possible. Sometimes mediators will use round tables specifically so that there are no, corners and angles, and people are, no one's feeling that they're pitted against each other. And so all of these things make a difference. And so you want to make sure you have enough room set aside so that if you have to, or if you're going to go into caucus, that you can utilize that space and that people will not be hearing each other because they share a common wall. And those are things that, when I first was doing this, I didn't really think about that, but it is incredibly important because these are confidential. And so nobody wants to be, sharing the wall with the other side, so to speak. And so just be mindful of those. Any additional ones you want to talk about, Judge Bradley?
No, only just, make sure you provide pads and pens so folks can make notes and give uninterrupted time to each other. And this doesn't happen often, but if you have any security concerns, make sure you consider safe egress for everyone. And in some occasions at the board, we even asked for the assistance of the Washington State Patrol. So, if you see those red flags, better safe than sorry, I always say. So let's see this in action. This is a portion of a much longer video, and it's from a workshop that was done in the UK in 2020. Disclaimer here, the mediator often refers to the two female individuals as guys. That grates on me. I wouldn't say it that way, but let's all put that aside, including me, and watch. So the scene is two employees are new to working with each other, and there's some friction, and they have to share an office. They have different working styles. They went to their manager, and the manager suggested mediation. When I pull up the screen, you'll see that there's a 7-stage mediation model that this instructor is using. And it's not that different from what we've discussed. It just kind of puts things in different places. So let's go ahead and watch some of this in action.
Face-to-face session. What that involves is the mediator opening the session with a welcome and some introductions and getting some rules in place. You'll see the 2 rules that we really need to have in this kind of case is really try and take it in turns to speak and try and avoid any language that's personally abusive and certainly any name calling. Then what we do is give people a bit of time to speak, summarise each party's individual view and think about the agenda of issues that needs to be resolved in this way. So that's what we do in the first part of stage 4. Let's have a quick look at that and see what happens with Sally and Heather. Some interesting body language at the start of this clip, I think you'll agree. So if you're okay with that, then what I would suggest is if I can hear from you both individually, if I could have one of you start to give you some uninterrupted time to talk about what's on your mind as you arrive this afternoon, and especially to talk about what you think needs to be discussed and what you want to get out of this, really. So if one of you would like to begin.
I would normally. Sally's the one with everything to say, but...
Pause you a second. So Sally, are you okay if Heather goes first?
Why not?
You're all right with that, yeah? Okay, so Heather, we'll hear from you first. So it's to have some uninterrupted time to talk to me about what's on your mind and especially what you'd like to get out of this. And while Heather's talking, Sally, if you could please listen to what she's got to say and try and refrain from interrupting. And when it's your turn, I'll make sure Heather does the same for you. Okay, so Heather.
Well, obviously, as I said this morning, I'm just finding it impossible to work with Sally. Absolutely impossible. She came into the department 6 months ago. And since then, it's just got worse and worse. She is constantly on the phone, not just to clients, to friends as well, people in other departments. She's extremely loud and brash when she's on the phone as well, organising a social life. It's hard to concentrate, and it's unprofessional as well, being like that with clients.
So there's Heather's uninterrupted time, and the mediator summarises what Heather's got to say now, and then we move into hearing Sally's uninterrupted time. So, Sally, thank you very much for your patience while we heard from Heather. And like I say, I'll ask Heather to be patient when we hear from you in a second. So just before we do that, Heather, from your point of view, you want to be able to work without interruption. You want to have little disturbance. That's the way you work. there's a couple of things that need to be talked about with regard to eating at the desk, with regard to how Sally structures her working day in a manner that suits your working day. You want to be able to speak to Sally, get hold of her. You want to be able to get hold of pieces of work that might be on her desk, which from, you describe as not as orderly as you would like it to be, or not as orderly as you would have your own workspace. And some stuff about, how the two of you generally sort of relate in the office, how much chat there is, how much social contact there is, and how much work time there is.
Yeah, sometimes it's as though I feel as though she's doing it on purpose. Like with the eating, I said, she knows I can't stand it. Yet when she gets a pack of crisps out, she puts one in her mouth, looks over with a big smirk on her face. As though she's doing it on purpose.
So to have an understanding about how that affects you or impacts
on you. She doesn't seem to think it's a condition. She just shrugs it off. Okay. It's just not showing me any respect whatsoever.
Something else we could be talking about this afternoon, really. Okay.
I mean, I've tried. I've tried. I tried to help her. She's never done accounts before. So I was trying to offer her training and things like that, but she seemed to think she knew it all, even though she'd not had training in it. I've
studied
so there
might
for years.
Be something there as well about, about how the two of you, sort of the level of competency that you're working at with the job, how much training you have or how much training you need and so on. All right, I'll pause you a second, Heather. There's a chance to come back to many of those things, all of those things. So, Sally, if I turn to you now, and thanks again for your patience while we heard from Heather.
Yeah.
So it's your turn to have some uninterrupted time to tell me about things from your point of view, what's on your mind this afternoon, but especially, what you'd like to get out of this.
Well, she was going on about my eating. It's ridiculous. I have to have small regular meals. And she's on about the fact that I'm taking crisps and then purposefully eating them in front of her loudly.
Just if I could just stop the two of you. First of all, Heather, when it's Sally's turn, as it was when it was your turn, I'd please ask you not to interrupt and to let Sally have her go. Sally, while you're making your comments, if you could make your comments directly to me, please, rather than to Heather. And the other thing, I didn't mention it earlier, but I would please ask you to refrain from sort of mimicking each other there. You were just beginning to do it. And again, it is tricky, this. It is a hard thing to have to go through. But if you're mimicking each other, then that can go to a difficult place. So I'd ask you please to try and refrain from that if you can.
Okay. It's been difficult since I first started here, and we've talked about this earlier, didn't we? She thinks the role was created for me through nepotism, the fact I've known James, that we've worked together before, and the fact that the job was created for me.
Everybody knows that it was created for you, for God's sake.
And again, if you just pause a second. So for a second time, Heather, for a second time, please. I do need to be able to hear what Sally's got to say. You had the privilege of your uninterrupted time when I asked Sally to wait. So if you could just hold on until she's done. There's plenty of opportunity for the two of you to have a conversation afterwards. So there we can see some of the frustrations boiling over. We can see how it's quite difficult for them to stay quiet while they're hearing from the other one allegations and some fairly put down comments. The mediator's got to step in just once or twice to make sure they're listening to each other, not talking over, and as well to try and address any behaviour that is disrespectful to the point that it's going to get in the way of the process working. So there's a bit of mimicking going on there and just a couple of aspects of language. So getting through that and allowing a bit of that behaviour, but of course there are boundaries and the mediator needs to apply those boundaries very fairly to the two parties equally. And then we progress to the latter part of stage 4. And this is the part where we're ready to start pulling things together and making everything into a workable agenda. So a few things there that you would like to discuss, a few things there you'd like to discuss. Some of them are in common, some of them are individual to you. So from what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a need to get a better deal about the state of the working environment. You like it orderly and knowing where you can put your hand on things. Sally, your desk is your desk. It's maybe not managed in the same way as Heather's is, but you
It's
prefer
still
to be.
considered tidy, you know.
You prefer to be in charge of how it is yourself,
Yeah,
you know.
definitely.
Regards the job, you know, Heather, I think you're looking for some reassurances that Sally is contributing as much as you are, and you're coming from the place of having, you know, run the department yourself. So that's, you know, your perception is coloured by that. Sally, from your point of view, you want Heather to trust you, to know and to acknowledge that you can actually do the job.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just bring the flip chart in then. And start wherever you want to start, really. So one of the topics you've talked about is around sort of noise, disturbance,
Yeah,
quiet, concentration in the office.
Talking too much and too loud on the phone.
So a need to get a better deal about when you talk, how much you talk. I don't know, it's up to you.
Just keeping the volume down a bit, you know.
Okay.
Well, I'd like some conversation from your
I'm
side.
not
There's
saying
none.
don't have no conversation.
There's no
I'm saying
How about if
keep it a bit
I,
quieter.
How about if I put conversation in the office, or just conversation?
Okay, yeah.
You know what it means.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, let's start with that. Well done. So that's the first one. So in that part, the mediator is trying to pull together the contributions from the two parties. You can see it's still fairly hostile. It's still quite accusatory. The mediator's job is to very insistently reframe things. So in terms of the two of them sort of finger pointing and making accusations one to the other, the mediator's saying, okay, so there's a need to get a better deal on this, there's a need to get a better deal on that. All the time trying to express empathy equally with the two parties. So the mediator's job in staying impartial is not to sit on the fence and be indifferent to what happens with these two guys, but actually to be empathic towards both of their sets of interests and to do that equally. So the idea is that in the end we get a win-win outcome that means both of them get their interests satisfied, and the way to do that is illustrated to an extent in that short clip, in the way that we see the mediator empathising with both sides, hopefully equally, and if they perceive that that's the case, we can keep them engaged as we move into the next bit, which is about the exploring and working on the issues in our stage 5. So we're moving into, after the agenda has been made, we're moving into the negotiation phase, where we agree where to start our discussions, which we saw a little bit of there. Again, the mediator using a lot of reframing, trying to get the two guys talking directly to each other now, and not talking so much to the mediator, and getting their dialogue going, moving on from the disagreements, and trying to grab the areas of consensus and write those up on the flip chart. So we're going to see now the stage 5, very short section of the stage 5, where we get into the negotiation phase. Which one would you like to pick now?
Time at desk, I think that kind of links in.
Time spent at the desk?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about that then. So this was raised by you, Heather, when you started.
Gosh,
You're talking about being able to get hold of Sally,
Yeah, well,
and having a sense of, you know, fair shares, but also if the stuff that the two of you are working on together, you've been able to find her and ask her things that you need to know.
yeah, I mean, at the moment, you're constantly getting up and going for breaks. I never know where you are. You know, we've got deadlines.
Yeah, but
and
it's
things
not
to
up to
meet.
you to decide when I have my breaks.
I'm not wanting to decide when you have your breaks. It would just be nice to know where you are. I need work from you sometimes to be able to continue or to put in other reports, and I never know where you are.
Yeah, but you're micromanaging. It's almost like you're
Oh, for
indicating
God's sake,
when I can
you're
have
always
a break.
doing that.
when
I'm not
I can
dictating.
So let me just pause the two of you. So Sally, you're saying you don't want to be micromanaged by Heather.
No.
Heather, you need things and they're dependent on Sally. You're relying on Sally for certain things to be able to do your job.
Exactly. I'm sorry if you do feel like you're micromanaged. That's not my intention.
No, you shouldn't be managing me at all.
Well, I'm not. But you have to appreciate I've got things to do that I need your work as an input into it, and I can't do it without it. But you're always off on breaks everywhere.
I'm not always off on break.
Let's face it, you're off quite a lot.
Well, there's a reason for that, isn't there? Because
yeah, because you don't do your work.
I don't feel comfortable. It's freezing in our room. It's a horrible place to be, and I will spend as much time somewhere else as possible.
Well, why don't you just get a heater or something? You know, then you haven't got an excuse to be going off all the time.
I didn't mean it like that, and you know it. It was about how you are towards me.
I wouldn't say it's freezing. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. You know, it goes two ways, Sal. It really does.
So Sally, would it be helpful for Heather to know the reasons, sort of why you're away from your desk?
Well, sometimes I'm doing it because it's just so uncomfortable in the room, and sometimes I'm doing it because I'm going to go for a break, and I'm so uncomfortable in the room, and sometimes I'm doing it.
So I'm going to pause it there. You can see how that's going, but you saw some of the techniques that we talked about, I hope. And even though there was a comment that it seemed more like couples counseling, surprisingly, yeah, a lot of times it does feel that way. So Meng, we're at the next slide.
Oh yeah, so thank you. All of the mediators of the board receive some kind of certification training, and in the past it's always been live, but we have had a couple versions where we have done virtual online training, and it's just extended the training because of the Zoom fatigue and other things that come into play when we're doing online trainings, virtual trainings, and we usually do them through National Judicial College, although we have utilized more local dispute resolution centers like the University of Washington and other places like that. Our certification programs that we send our judges to are typically a 40-hour course, and there are tons and tons of role playing. And so when people think about going to these trainings, it's not, it's fun, but it's not, one where you're going to be sitting and listening all day. It is one where you are, I'd probably say, for over half of it, you are in role plays and you're practicing these techniques. Okay.
And those role plays are really critical because they always include an observer. And so that observer's perspective, I find extremely useful, someone who's not involved in the mediation, but can see reactions and help you understand how you might be coming across. So what does mediation look like at OAH? OAH has a huge number of different caseloads, and currently we're not doing mediation on all caseloads. I'm seeing messages that the sound is really bad. Not sure how I can help that.
Yeah, if we could get more information about what that is. Occasionally I'll hear some feedback, but I haven't heard it recently, so. Gets quiet, then noisy, then tinny. Okay. Am I coming through okay?
You are coming in through okay, and so is Laura. I think it's more of that individual speaker maybe having issues.
Okay. Well, we'll see where we're going or how we're going. Go ahead, Judge Bradley.
So currently we're doing mediation on the regulatory caseload, the OSPI, the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, the Healthcare Authority Home and Community Services cases, and occasionally on the Healthcare Authority adjusted minimum adjusted gross income cases. So I gathered some information just related to the poll that we did earlier. The OSPI caseload has done 29 settlement conferences to date. Those are typically a full day. Sometimes a second day is needed. The mediators typically use shuttle facilitation or shuttle style, so the parties are not together. They only do those for parties that are represented. The settlement rate is about 66%. And they find the shuttle style effective because it allows the parents to get things off their chest. For the healthcare authority cases, it's about 6 to 8 cases mediated per week. They're all done on Wednesday. They're usually scheduled for an hour. The process is a little more abbreviated, and most parties are not represented. About 1/3 settle. The benefits that the judge who holds those has found is there's more meaningful participation. It helps reduce the case age. It clarifies issues. It leaves the parties with a better understanding of the issues and the hearing process and what the next steps might be. So again, that theme of, being able to vent, and sometimes the appealing party just needs to understand, and that can resolve a case. sometimes the agency just needs more information. If that comes out in mediation, then that can resolve the case. Regulatory caseload, a wide variety of agencies follow that under that umbrella. It could be a college Title IX case where there's a more restorative justice approach, and that might also be true in OSPI cases for other things like contractor registrations, licensing, and violations. Although at first glance you might think, well, that's just about money. The couple that I have done, it isn't just about money. It's about safety. It's about making sure folks follow the law. For the contractor, it's about negotiating something that they can reasonably pay and not go out of business, and maybe setting up processes to make sure that things they do are done correctly in the future. So in quite a few cases, parties are frustrated with the agency and they just really want a face to sit in front of and have them hear how they feel and how they think they've been treated. So we'll turn to the board, Ming.
Thanks. And I'll go through this rather quickly because I recognize we have a minute left. And so at the board, mediations can be done by phone, by video, or in person. And we utilize all of those options. During the pandemic, we obviously didn't have them in person, but we have, we will be allowing them to be back in person starting on December 1 of this year. Otherwise, we have been doing them by phone or video. Settlement can look like many different things, whether it's a definition of the issues or any of those things that can happen in a mediation, stipulations, about doctors and issues and scope. And success is really any lawful agreement, entirely or partially, that makes it easier if it has to go to a hearing down the road. And so we're good on that one. Go ahead and advance the slide, please.
So there's a slide about online mediation considerations. Just think about, do people have technology? How can they access it? Are they going to need help accessing it? How are you going to monitor possible distractions, which might be harder to monitor on a video screen? There's a link to a video that we don't have time to play, but it is a link so you can look at it on your own. It's called Mediation in the Metaverse, where we have avatars in the mediation room, and it's done from the perspective of one of the parties. It's pretty interesting. Gosh, we're so much out of time. I wish we had been able to get through all of this, but I think the rest of it is pretty self-explanatory, and on the last page is our contact information. So if you have other questions, you want to engage with us further, please feel free to reach out.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and attention today.
Absolutely. Thank you.